Imagine taking a DNA test and discovering something impossible. Your mother's bloodline traces back thousands of years to indigenous South America, but your father's, pure European. Now imagine an entire nation with this exact pattern. Welcome to Paraguay, where 87% of the population carries indigenous mothers in their mitochondrial DNA, but 92% have European fathers in their Y chromosomes. This isn't just unusual. According to a 2021 genetic study published in the journal Genes, Paraguay has the most extreme sex-biased genetic admixture in all of South America. Think about what that means. Somewhere in history, indigenous men almost completely vanished from the gene pool while indigenous women's bloodlines survived intact across 5 centuries. This is the story written in Paraguayan DNA. A story of survival, catastrophe, horror, and a choice that mothers made in whispered conversations that would echo through generations. The research team from the University of Porto and Rio de Janeiro analyzed 548 Paraguayans using 3 different DNA markers: mitochondrial DNA from mothers, Y chromosome DNA from fathers, and autosomal DNA from both parents. What they found was described as a typical South American profile with a unique pattern of admixture. But here's the question that will drive everything you're about to hear. How does a nation lose its fathers but keep its mothers? And what does that tell us about survival itself? If you're fascinated by hidden genetic mysteries that rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancestry, subscribe, because this story gets darker. Because this wasn't evolution, this was catastrophe, and it happened twice. Sure, let's go back to 1537. Spanish conquistadors arrive in what is now Asunción, Paraguay. But unlike other colonial ventures, they arrive with almost no Spanish women. Their strategy? Mass intermarriage with the indigenous Guarani people. Historical records reveal something shocking. By 1570, there were only 300 pure Spaniards in the territory, but there were 10,000 mestizo children, mixed European and indigenous heritage. Do the math. Each Spanish man had averaged between 10 to 20 Guarani wives. This wasn't romance, this was a calculated colonial strategy. Create a mestizo population loyal to Spain but adapted to the land. The Guarani, for their part, had cultural traditions of forming alliances through intermarriage. They saw it as a path to peace. But in 1556, everything changed. After Spain implemented the encomienda system, indigenous people were enslaved and forced to work agricultural fields. Unlike Brazil or Peru, Paraguay didn't have massive plantations or gold mines, so relatively few African slaves were brought in. Instead, the colony was built on the backs of indigenous labor. Here's what the DNA tells us about this period. The genetic replacement was already happening. Indigenous men worked themselves to death in the fields. European men fathered the next generation. And Guarani mothers raised children who spoke their language but carried European names. According to research published in Multilingual Education by Shaw Guinan, the mestizo children grew up speaking Guarani, the language of their mothers, not Spanish. By the time of Paraguayan independence in 1811, the country had an admixed population unlike anywhere else in the Americas. The DNA was already changing. But then came the war that would finish what colonization started. The War of the Triple Alliance begins. Paraguay versus Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay combined. Historian Steven Pinker would later classify it as proportionately the most destructive war anywhere in modern times. Let me give you the numbers. Paraguay's pre-war population, between 450,000 and 525,000 people. Post-war survival count from the 1870 census conducted by the victorious Allied forces, 221,079 people total. Only 28,746 adult men. Historians Thomas Wigham and Barbara Pothast analyzed parish records, census data, and military documents. Their conclusion: so published in the Hispanic American Historical Review, Paraguay lost between 60 and 69% of its entire population. But among military-age males, some estimates suggest up to 90% perished. Picture the final battles. Christmas Day, 1868. The Battle of Ita-Ivate. Less than 6,000 Paraguayans, many of them children aged 10 to 14 wearing fake beards to look like men, faced over 24,000 enemy soldiers. The U.S. ambassador to Paraguay witnessed it and wrote, "It pains me to say that more than half of the Paraguayan army is now made up of children. The Allies lost less than 1,000 men. Paraguay lost nearly all that remained of its army." But here's what most people don't know. Combat wasn't the main killer, disease was. Cholera, dysentery, yellow fever swept through both armies and the civilian population. And research indicates that approximately 70% of deaths came from epidemics, not bullets. The war didn't just kill soldiers. It collapsed agriculture, sanitation, and any infrastructure that could have saved lives. When the war ended in 1870, the gender ratio was catastrophic. Some regions had 7 women for every surviving man. The nation faced a demographic problem never seen before or since in the Americas. The men were gone. But the mothers? They had one weapon left. Here's something that will shock you. Paraguay is the only nation in Latin America where an indigenous language is spoken by the majority of non-indigenous people. Today, 90% of Paraguayans understand Guarani. Compare that to other countries. In Peru, only 13 to 14% speak Quechua. In Bolivia, only 2% speak Aymara as a first language. These were massive empires with millions of speakers. They nearly went extinct. So why did Guarani survive? After the War of the Triple Alliance, Guarani women made a choice. They would speak only Guarani to their children. Not Spanish, not Portuguese. Guarani. It was a way to distinguish themselves from the Brazilian and Argentine invaders who had slaughtered their husbands, brothers, and sons. The language became resistance. According to interviews documented in research by linguist Shaw Ginan at Western Washington University, women passed Guarani down in the home, the one place Spanish authorities couldn't control. But it wasn't easy. In 1770, King Carlos III of Spain had issued a royal decree to extinguish indigenous languages in the colonies. Women were banned from official employment, politics, and schools, the very places where Spanish dominated. So they taught Guarani where they could, at home, in whispers, in lullabies. Fast forward to the 20th century. Under dictator Alfredo Stroessner's regime from 1954 to 1989, Guarani was banned in public. Children caught speaking it were forced to kneel on salt grains and corn kernels for hours as punishment. But it survived. The 2012 Paraguayan census shows that 46.3% of the population speaks Jopara, a mixture of Guarani and Spanish. Another 34% speak only Guarani. Just 15.3% speak only Spanish. The language survived in kitchens and whispered bedtime stories. But could the DNA tell a different story? Let's talk about the ghost fathers, the men whose DNA replaced the indigenous male lineage almost entirely. When researchers analyzed Y chromosome data, the genetic marker passed from father to son, they found that 92.2% of Paraguayan men carry European paternal lineages. Specifically, haplogroups from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. But here's where it gets interesting. The genetic pattern suggests something crucial: multiple influxes of European males, not just one. The admixture didn't happen once during colonization and stop, it kept happening. After 1870, the Paraguayan government actively encouraged immigration to solve the male shortage. They offered land grants, tax exemptions, anything to bring in settlers. Most came from neighboring countries, Brazil and Argentina, which already had admixed populations with high European ancestry. According to the 2021 study in Genes, immigrants from Brazil represent 67% of modern immigration to Paraguay, with Argentinians making up another 19%. These men brought European Y chromosomes, yes, but they also brought genomes already mixed with indigenous and African ancestry from their own country's colonial histories. Now here's the surprise. When researchers analyzed autosomal DNA, the full genome you inherit from both parents, they found 55.4% European ancestry. That's higher than you'd expect if you just averaged maternal DNA, 13% European, and paternal DNA, 92% European. Why? Because the post-war admixture involved people who were already admixed. European men, yes, but also Brazilian and Argentine men who themselves had indigenous and African grandmothers. And there's another detail. Or post-war illegitimacy rates, children born outside of marriage, reached 70% in some regions. With so few men available, traditional marriage structures collapsed. Women raised children alone. Female-headed households became the norm, not the exception. Research published in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization in 2022 found that even 150 years later, regions with worse post-war male losses still have higher rates of out-of-wedlock births, better female educational outcomes, and more gender-equal attitudes. The trauma didn't just affect one generation, it rewired the culture. But there's one more twist. The 2017 study found that only 43% of modern Paraguayans have parents born in the same location. The population is genetically homogeneous but geographically mobile. Internal migration has erased regional genetic differences. So if the fathers are European and the mothers are indigenous, who are Paraguayans really? Let's go back to the mothers. Because their story is written in mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child. The data is stunning. 87.2% of Paraguayans carry Native American mitochondrial haplogroups. Lineages designated A2, B2, C1, and D1. These are the same genetic signatures found in indigenous populations across South America dating back thousands of years. The most common lineage is C1, representing 31% of all native maternal haplogroups. Researchers identified strong founder effects, meaning certain lineages are concentrated in specific regions, particularly around the Paraná River basin. But here's what's fascinating. When researchers compared Paraguay's maternal DNA to other South American populations, they found the closest genetic match wasn't to other Spanish colonies. It was to Brazilian indigenous groups. Why? Because before Europeans ever arrived, the Tupi-Guarani people inhabited a vast territory stretching from Brazil's northeastern coast all the way to Paraguay. The genetic similarity suggests an ancient connection that predates colonization by centuries. This is what we mean by preservation of the maternal background. While the paternal lineages were almost completely replaced, the maternal lineages remained intact. Unbroken transmission from pre-Columbian times to the present day. And there's a cultural parallel. The same women who preserved Guarani language also preserved genetic memory. Research shows that in Guarani culture, mothers were the primary educators of children. They controlled what happened in the home. Even today, that legacy persists. Studies show that Guarani is more likely to be spoken in rural areas and in homes, the domains traditionally controlled by women. Spanish is more common in cities and formal settings. But there's something else in the DNA, something that doesn't fit any narrative. African ancestry. 10.8% according to autosomal analysis, but only 4% in maternal mitochondrial DNA. This is strange. In most of Latin America, if you have African ancestry, it's primarily maternal because of the sexual exploitation of enslaved women during colonial times. But in Paraguay, the pattern is different. Historical records show that Paraguay received very few African slaves compared to Brazil, Cuba, or other plantation economies. The colony didn't have sugar plantations or gold mines that required massive slave labor. According to research, most African ancestry entered Paraguay through a different route. Remember those post-war immigrants from Brazil and Argentina? They brought African genetic ancestry with them. Brazil had one of the largest slave populations in history. Argentina, despite whitewashing its history, also had significant African populations that were later genetically absorbed into the mestizo majority. So when these already admixed immigrants married into Paraguayan families, they introduced African DNA, but it wasn't from direct enslavement in Paraguay itself. It was inherited from other countries' colonial histories. This is what geneticists call secondary admixture. The African contribution exists, but it arrived indirectly, unfiltered through neighboring populations. And here's the problem. Almost no major genetic studies exist on African Paraguayan communities. There are no comprehensive genealogical records of enslaved populations. That history has been erased. The African ancestry is there, written in the genome. But history erased the story. Here's the paradox that defines modern Paraguay. European blood, indigenous soul. In 1992, Paraguay became one of the few countries in the world to recognize an indigenous language as co-official with a European language. The Constitution declared Guarani equal to Spanish. In 2010, the languages law went further. It requires all public officials to learn Guarani. All government publications must have Guarani versions. Bilingual education is mandatory from elementary school onward. No other Latin American country has achieved this. Peru and Bolivia have constitutional recognition of indigenous languages, but Spanish remains the dominant language of power. In Paraguay, you literally cannot work in government without speaking Guarani. The national drink is tereré, an iced yerba mate drink with indigenous origins. The national bread is chipa. There's even a Guarani version of the national anthem. European genetics coexist with indigenous cultural identity in a way that's unique in the Americas. But here's the bitter irony. While 90% of the general population speaks Guarani, indigenous Guarani communities themselves face catastrophic poverty. A 2015 UNESCO report described the situation as an emergency. Indigenous people have a 75% poverty rate and 60% extreme poverty rate, far exceeding national averages. And child malnutrition among indigenous populations is 41.7% compared to 17.5% nationally. And here's something most people don't realize. Paraguayan Guarani, the language spoken by the mestizo majority, is not the same as Mbia Guarani or Ava Guarani spoken by actual indigenous communities. The languages are mutually intelligible, but they evolved separately. Essentially, non-indigenous Paraguayans appropriated the language and made it a symbol of national identity, but not the people. Indigenous communities remain marginalized, landless, and discriminated against. The DNA says European. The language says indigenous. But the reality says appropriation. So what does the future say? The genetic story of Paraguay isn't finished. It's still being written. Since the 1960s, there's been a massive influx of Brazilian immigrants, over 400,000 people known as Brasiguaios. They're concentrated along the border regions, farming soy and other cash crops. These new immigrants bring different genetic profiles. Higher European ancestry than traditional Paraguayans in some cases, but also significant African and indigenous ancestry from Brazil's own complex colonial history. New admixture patterns are forming right now, and the language is changing too. Younger, urban Paraguayans increasingly speak Spanish as their first language. Guarani is declining in cities despite legal protections. A generational shift is happening. Activist David Galeano Oliveira, quoted in Sapiens magazine, explains the challenge. We all live in two worlds, the concrete world and the virtual one. Guarani remains primarily an oral language. There's limited presence online, in social media, in digital spaces where young people spend their time. If Guarani can't exist in the digital world, can it survive the 21st century? And there's another gap in the research. Almost no comprehensive genetic studies exist on Paraguay's western Chaco region, home to Mennonite communities and other indigenous groups. No major research on Japanese, Korean, or Chinese immigrant integration. No studies on the 19 other indigenous languages still spoken by about 50,000 people. The genetic research focuses almost exclusively on the Eastern mestizo majority. But Paraguay is more complex than that. Here's what we know. Genetic homogeneity masks cultural complexity. The DNA might be similar across regions, but the lived experiences, languages, and identities are not. The pattern isn't finished. Well, Paraguay's DNA continues to change with each generation of border crossings, internal migrations, and language shifts. So, what is Paraguayan DNA? It's a story where mothers won the genetic war even as fathers rewrote the population. where 87% indigenous maternal lineage coexists with 92% European paternal lineage, where autosomal DNA sits at 55% European, creating an identity that belongs fully to neither world. 150 years after the War of the Triple Alliance, the trauma is still visible. Research published in 2022 shows that regions with worse male losses during the war still have higher out-of-wedlock birth rates, better female educational outcomes, and more gender-equal social norms. The war ended in 1870, but its effects are written in the culture, the family structures, the very DNA of modern Paraguayans. And there's a philosophical question buried in all this data. If your maternal ancestry is indigenous, but your genetics are majority European and your language is shared across ethnic boundaries, what makes you Paraguayan? There's no single answer in the DNA. Paraguayan identity exists in the contradiction itself, in the space between what was lost and what survived, in the choice that Guarani mothers made to preserve their language even as their sons' bloodlines disappeared. Every DNA test reveals a war, a survival strategy, and a woman who refused to let her lineage disappear. This isn't just Paraguay's story. Every Latin American genome hides similar contradictions, layers of admixture, trauma, resistance, and survival written in genetic code that we're only beginning to read. The past is data. But the future? That remains unwritten.